Welcome into Clippers Talk. I'm Adam Auslund. This is episode 3 of our new YouTube series we're doing. It's not just on Spotify, iHeart, iTunes. It's not just a podcast anymore. It's a vodcast. But I'm trying to get this YouTube off the ground a little bit. And so far, we're like a Boeing plane or something like that. Struggling a little bit here, but just started this account. So you can get in early on the ground floor. Same with the Clippers Talk accounts. They're on TikTok. They're on the gram. You can find me there. I do some fitness stuff as well if you're into that. So been doing this podcast for a few years. Just didn't have a vodcast until now. I'll be doing this live from Intuit Dome all season long, bringing you a ton of behind the scenes stuff. Anything you want, social media, live streaming during the games, behind the scenes, pregame pressers with Coach Lou, all of that. I am active now, as the kids like to say. Coming up on today's show, we'll have your favorites, your least favorites, a new cap giveaway, the state of the West, Westbrook, now with the Denver Nuggets. Lauren Marketing got paid $240 million. He's staying with Utah. What does that mean for the rest of the market and guys that are available out there? We'll talk about that with our special guest. So let's bring him in. Joining me today is a senior writer and host on the Action Network along with Locked On Nuggets. He's at HP Basketball. That's where you find him. One of the reasons he's such a great follow is because he's not afraid to push back. He's not afraid to get down into the mud a little bit. He's not as petty as I am, of course. Nobody is. But he will give you strong opinions, and that's what we love about this man. We just happen to disagree about something that I felt very strongly about recently. So I called him out. I said, Matt Moore, will you come on the show? And he said he's game, and he is here. Matt Moore at HP Basketball is joining me here on Clippers Talk, a YouTube edition at that. Matt, just the fact that you made it here is already like softening my stance. Like, I don't know if I can go that hard anymore on this debate. Thanks for being here.
I didn't come on this show to get softball, man. Come on now. I didn't open up to come on because I thought it was going to be easy. It's tough though, right? Like everyone gets all riled up on Twitter and on social media, and we can take these tones with each other. But when you're looking at each other face to face, even in the camera, it's like, oh man, like it's just two people talking sports. It's not that big of a deal. But come on, we can get into this. It's okay.
Okay. Now, I can certainly be argumentative and difficult to deal with. I don't know if this has ever happened to you, but just recently to me, I happened to be in a chat where people thought I wasn't, and they started talking about me, not realizing I could see what they were saying. That's a rough day. That's tough. So I know how I can be perceived sometimes, but I'm not opposed to ultimately pointless basketball conversations. We'll make it better than that. But when people don't want to move an inch off their position, they're committed to dying on that hill on Twitter. We see it all the time. Now, we're kind of similar, I think, in that way. We embrace debate, and you do the research. You're a high-level basketball guy. You know teams. It's not just the Denver Nuggets. You have a good grasp of what's happening in the landscape of the NBA, and we kind of take pride in that. So being headstrong as we are, it was only a matter of time where we would start crossing blades and then cross each other on this path here on YouTube. So I am excited. Now, I don't want to relitigate the entire debate we had on Twitter just about a month ago. It was actually the day that Paul George ended up signing with the Philadelphia 76ers, or maybe the day before because it happened later that night. But it started like this. I do have the receipts. I'm telling you, I am petty. There are 6 pages here, man. Are you kidding me? This is how deep we went into it. It started with a tweet from you at HP Basketball with his 150,000 followers. Can't believe he's doing me the favor of coming on. He said, pissing off PG while placating Kawhi at maximum was a misstep, but let's see if the Clippers pull a rabbit out of a hat. I responded saying, asking him to take less than what Kawhi took, a misstep, to which you retweeted. You said, yes, I want to be clear on this. Paul George has fewer season-ending injuries, carries the team more often when Kawhi's out, is more reliable and communicative with the team. Kawhi's apex is awesome with a great team around him. PG does all the other stuff and doesn't get credit for it. Then things kind of got to the crux of the issue. As I brought up how many games Kawhi and Paul George have both missed, There's about a 40-game difference between the two. And I would say when it comes to Kawhi and Paul George, the difference in high-level play between them on the court is greater than the difference of amount of games missed between the two in their Clippers careers so far. But you point out that Paul George, in your opinion, and this is where I think things got off the rail for some people that were kind of voyeuring the debate going on X, you said it goes beyond that stuff, like being a connector, being a leader, being someone who sets the right tone. And that kind of set off an alarm for me a little bit because it sounds like you're talking about another guy. And I like Paul George. And even with the B team comment, we'll get into that probably at some point too. I still like Paul George. He's a top 5 all-time Clipper. I just don't know if those are where his strengths lie. The floor is yours, my friend.
Yeah, so I think some of this gets into the complicated nature of like the arc of this team, right? Where that 2020 team that imploded in the bubble was so clearly built with guys that didn't trust PG. And that to me was like where a lot of the conflict came in. Like the chemistry and the lack of leadership to me with Lou Williams and Trez really kind of like echoed their lack of faith and confidence and their willingness to follow behind PG. A lot of this for me comes down to the fact of, look, I can understand how good Kawhi is across the board when he's good, even and when he's healthy and when he's good, because those two things are no longer the same. And still be able to understand that like Kawhi is there are a million anecdotes of him, quote, lead by example, not loud in the locker room, a guy that makes jokes around the edges at assistant coach's expense, these types of elements versus I have a history of like, I've talked to Paul George in Indiana, I've talked to Paul George in OKC, and I've talked to his teammates in both of those places. And he was a guy that made locker rooms better, that made teams more connected. His play style isn't such that it's just like, all right, let's give him the ball and we'll just wait for PG to do what he does. Now, I think it devolved a little bit into that last year because of some of the challenges that they had with integrating all of the talent, which to me is like another thing where I kind of look at Ty Lue a little bit sideways and I'm like, man, what went off the rails here? I look at Paul George as a guy that does fill in those gaps. He is a guy that fills in gaps. He is not the alpha leader, get behind me guy, but he's also not Mr. I'll practice when I want to, when I feel like jumping on the helicopter to come up from San Diego, Mr. I will determine absolutely everything. And maybe I'll tell you I'm playing and maybe I'll tell you 15 minutes before I'm going to show up. And somebody's got to make up for that. And I've seen Paul George do that. And especially to start last season, I just thought he had an absolutely phenomenal year. Like the start of last season, I thought for that first month or so, I thought he was honestly the best Clipper. Now,
I agree.
Kawhi was phenomenal in the middle of the season before he got hurt. Like he was absolutely terrific, was back to looking like, and that was a big reason why I and a lot of people were like, hey, the Clippers might actually do this time because they were getting so many good efforts. Harden was doing his best to be himself, but also fit around the edges. All of it was kind of coming together. And if you want to say like, look, the team derailed when Kawhi went out and if PG was that guy, he would have held that team up. I don't have a real answer there. I don't have a real good response for that. And a lot of fans commented after we got into this debate about kind of all of the things that had been indicated by beat writers throughout the season. And like, look, I try and keep a close eye on those things as best I can, but when you're following 30 teams, you are going to miss things. So I'm open to the possibility that this year, he wasn't that guy in part because I think of those contract discussions, but I have to look at the broad spectrum of Paul George's career and not just this most recent arc with him, with the Clippers, and evaluating who he is as a player in the NBA.
Okay. Well stated. I see your point. I would just say that when it comes to his Clippers tenure, this is nothing new. For all the good he does on the court, and they are going to miss him, and it is very tough to make the argument they're a better team without Paul George, and I am not doing that. I'm talking about leadership and what that means and how he helped in those areas. And to me, you go back to 2020 where you started, maybe one of the reasons they didn't trust him as much is because, I don't know, he scored 18 points per game against the Dallas Mavericks in that first round. It was a complete shell of himself, and the playoff P stuff and pandemic P stuff was being said. But then the reports came out after they imploded where he and Kawhi were miserable in that game 7. Kawhi was great throughout that playoff run. Paul George was not at all, but they were both bad in the game 7. But afterwards, there was that report out of The Athletic after the season saying Paul George was trying to rally the troops and guys were rolling their eyes afterwards. Like, how is he the guy trying to get them up and say, hey, we can do this next year? And it's like, dude, you just played worse than anybody on the team and you are being paid as much as almost anyone on the team. Then afterwards, going into the next season, he talks about, he didn't say he was going to be on his bully stuff, but he said he was going to be on MFers, A's, I think, or something like that on the All the Smoke podcast, which is fine. But he also said, he pointed out that one of the issues was being in the JJ Redick role, coming off a lot of pin downs in Doc's offense and how it's going to be different and how he needs the ball in his hands more with Coach Lue. The problem was a season later, he spoke out about not wanting the ball in his hands as much, wanting to play more off ball. Didn't like being picked up 94 feet by Drew Holiday. Thought he could do it, but then couldn't. Thought he could do some of these responsibilities that are asked of max players, but then realized he couldn't. Just like when he realized, when he said on the JJ Redick podcast, that he's not a number one on a championship team. Now, when I think of those two things, I have a hard time reconciling that with leadership. The accountability part, the responsibility of being a max player or being a top 2 player on the team. And it's not just that. I mean, when you come out, and this was, I think, 2 years ago now, so the start of the 22-23 season, and say, out of nowhere, he can say it was out of context at the Philadelphia presser recently. Out of nowhere, he's talking about LeBron and Dwayne Wade coming together with the Miami Heat. The reporters did not probe him or ask him this question. We've had multiple guys on talk with Tomer Azarli, guys who were in the locker room at that time, Farbod Esenshari. What was the context of this? And I have a full 1.5-minute clip of Paul George saying, I'm the number 2. There's no issue there. I'm the number 2. Not the 1B, he said, the number 2. I'm there to support Kawhi Leonard. Well, during our debate here, at one point, you had told me the idea was for them to be equals and partners, not the guy who doesn't lead at all be number 1 and him be the Robin. It's like, yeah, it was the idea. He went away from the idea.
So I think the problem with that, so I look at that more as, and this happens quite a bit actually with the NBA. Guys are friends and they want to play together, and then they actually get into a locker room and they're like, oh, this is not what I thought it was going to be. And I think that when PG kind of signed on, it was going to be like me and Kawhi together, both great players together. And then this is from my perspective, you can't do that with Kawhi because Kawhi doesn't give anything. He doesn't give at all. There's no like back and forth. There's no like, how do we figure this out? There's just
by what examples?
Man gets paid.
What examples?
The thing is that if we kind of look at the history, if we look at kind of how the Raptors look, think about the switch from the Spurs to the Raptors.
Okay.
Right. The idea is like, it was perfect and seamless. And like, it wasn't, it was really fascinating. And I wrote a lot about it at the time. They basically had the Raptors offense, and then section out over here was like Danny Green and Kawhi Leonard running 2-man game because Danny knew all the places where Kawhi liked to get the ball, and just like added that thing on top of it. There's all of this evidence that Kawhi is like none of these things. I'm open to the idea that Paul George wasn't enough of these things that we're talking about, that he wasn't a good enough at these things that we're talking about. My issue is that for me, all of it stems from the identity, style, and approach of your best player who can't be your best player because of his availability crossed with how he behaves. And that combination, I think, causes a lot of problems for guys like Paul George. I think this is why you have this like back and forth where it's like, he feels like he gets there and it's like, yeah, it's gonna be Kawhi and PG. And then later it's, oh no, I'm the B, I'm the number 2. I have to be behind Kawhi because Kawhi can't be anything else.
Well, no one is telling him to be that guy would be my point. Coach Lue talked to him after that. He has had to talk to him multiple times, like this year when all of a sudden Paul George said, I want to be the glue guy out there and try to do all the little things when they got James Harden and just try to make it work after they had lost 5 games in a row to start things off with James Harden next to those two. And so Coach Lue has to correct him and say, no, you're a bad mother effer. You're a badass. You have to be a number 1.
Why do you think he got there? Like, why do you think that what do you think led to him to that point where he started building? Do you think it's just like he didn't want it? It was just like too scary. It was too much pressure for him.
I think he is noticeably shied away from responsibility and accountability. Okay. I think it's very apparent to those who have paid attention to him. I think a lot of Thunder fans and Indiana fans might say the same thing in the comment section about Paul George.
I don't necessarily disagree with that. I think the Thunder fans might, but I think you're right about Indiana for sure.
So it's not just an isolated season.
Sure.
It's not just isolated to the Clippers tenure. It goes back a ways with him, is my point.
But the other thing
you can talk about Kawhi, but it's a little bit deflecting. I mean, I'm talking about whether or not Paul George is a leader.
But for me, that's the thing is there's poison in the well. Your best player can't be Kawhi. You're never going to have a good enough team structure.
Well, he's won 2 championships doing that, so I think it works.
Whoa. Wasn't the best player when he won the first championship.
He was the best player in the biggest moment.
No, he was not the best player in the biggest
he wasn't the finals MVP in 2014.
He was finals MVP. Why did he win that award?
Was that not the biggest moment?
Why did he win that award?
Because of his defense and because of what he was excelling at offensively.
Because they couldn't give it to LeBron. And so they gave it to the guy that only held LeBron to something ridiculous.
So he was only the best player on his team. Sorry, he wasn't the best player in the series. Is that your point?
I don't even think he was the best player on that team.
Who was the best player then over him in the finals for the Spurs?
Honestly, that was
who was doing more impactful. I think his plus minus was by far the best of the team.
But go back and look at the usage.
The offensive and defensive ratings for the Spurs in that finals when he was on the floor, they were like a plus 30 per 100 possessions.
But look at how that team was structured. Look at what that team was great at. Look at how it played.
Even if I wanted to concede that the 2014 Finals MVP was in fact not the best player on the team that won the NBA Finals, he obviously was in 2019 for the Toronto Raptors.
Sure. And that was
we know his style can work.
Whoa, if Kevin Durant and Klay Thompson both get severely injured, then yes,
or if there's just not the ultimate super team of all time to begin with, right?
So what I'm trying to get to here is that Kawhi is amazing and awesome and a top 10 NBA player. But he is overstated. And for some reason, he avoids all of this criticism that we're talking about here. All of it. No one comes after him. He's got a number of Game 7 absolute stinkers on his resume, but Paul George gets called out for all of his failures.
Kawhi Leonard, his last 60 playoff games is at 50, 40, 90 splits on 30 points per game.
That's not what we're talking about. We're not talking about the
overall. You just said
numbers.
He has, it's worlds apart from where Paul George is in his playoff career. You could say the Game 7 against the Denver Nuggets was awful. You can also point out, the 45 in a must-win game in the first round in 2021 on the road against the Dallas Mavericks when they had the crowd back. They would have lost that series in the first round. Everybody likes to talk about Paul George getting them to the Western Conference Finals.
Give you credit for beating a Dallas Mavericks team you should have never trailed to in the first place. I'm sorry. That should have been a
Did they trail because Kawhi Leonard wasn't good enough while putting up Shaq Finals numbers of efficiency in that series?
I don't disagree. He was amazing in that series, man. I don't disagree.
So they don't even get to the Western Conference Finals if they don't get out of the first round. Yet so many people
congratulations for getting out of the first round.
You're talking about so Paul George getting them to the Western Conference Finals. Have you heard that?
I'm sorry, what?
Paul George in 2021 getting them to the Western Conference Finals. Have you heard that argument?
Yes.
Do you think that's accurate?
No.
That's my point. Like Kawhi was just as much a part of that because they don't even make it out of the first round if he doesn't go MJ 93.
Again, we're talking about I'm not arguing that Paul George is a better player than Kawhi Leonard, right?
Sounds like you're saying they're a lot closer than some people realize, and I would push back heavy against that.
A better argument is that Paul George has had to do way more of the work that you would expect between the two. That's the better way to put this.
In what way?
So
because of availability? Because outside of that, on the court, they aren't close.
In part because of the availability. In part because of how they play, in part because of all of these intangible things that we're talking about Paul George not being good enough at when Kawhi Leonard is a 0 on them.
And when Kawhi's on the court, he's a 0 who's won a championship leading a team. So I guess,
but he wasn't.
I guess leadership works.
He came into a team with an existing leadership structure with Kyle Lowry.
Give Kyle Lowry the Finals MVP. Then he made the shot against.
Man, I'm not talking about on court. Look, if we're talking about if we're talking about production, efficiency, and level of play,
you're criticizing a guy though for his lack of leadership, who has been the on-court leader, the best player for teams.
No. Being the on-court leader doesn't mean
there are two ways.
Hang on. Being the on-court leader doesn't mean scoring the most points, my man.
It means the most impactful player on the court.
We can be more than that.
It
We
means
can
the
be
most
more than
impactful
that.
player on the court. I'm being more than that. It means the most impactful player. He's the most impactful player by far, the two-way superstar.
So now this is an interesting one. Do you think that Paul George isn't impactful?
No, that's not my point.
Okay, all right, that's fair. I'm not suggesting you are. I want to clarify.
I
So
think
now
Paul
we're just talking
George
about
is
the
his
gap.
top 5 all-time Clipper. I think he was a
Right.
good, very good Clipper.
Now we're just
overall.
talking about the difference between the two, right?
Sure.
And we're just talking about trying to figure out what that gap is between the two. And particularly, we're trying to figure out whether or not Paul George should have been insulted by how the Clippers approached the contract offers.
Tell
right?
me about that. Tell me about that, because that is where this tweet thread started.
Yeah.
You thought they fumbled the bag with Paul George by
So
offering him 2 for 60, right?
yeah, I wrote about this.
Except it wasn't 2 for 60.
I wrote about, well, that was what we had at the time, right?
Yeah.
So I wrote about this at the time, or I wrote about this over the summer. And one of the things I have is, I don't mind if you decide you don't want to be in business with Paul George anymore. If you look at this and you're just like, look, man, we can't go in the second apron. Like, we can't do this. We cannot hand out this contract to you. So we can do this. We can do this other thing. We can manage it this way. We can go this approach. We can do these things. We can't get there. The minute you decide that, the minute you to get that to that point, you need to not extend Kawhi Leonard. You need to immediately be like, we are tearing this thing down. We are not heading in that direction. We're tearing this thing down. They could have traded Kawhi at the deadline and have set themselves up for, like, had a exciting young team going into it and set themselves up really well, and then let Paul walk, let Harden walk, started over. But this half measure to be like, well, no, Paul
Starting
George,
over with 0 first-round picks. This is the way.
Paul, well, that's more my point, though. How many, because of the 2 NBA championships as the leader on the team, you could get the haul that can replenish some of those problems for you, right?
Tell me if I'm onto something here. This is less about Paul George and you believing in his leadership, which has very little evidence for. This is about Kawhi Leonard.
No, I don't think that's
I
true.
could give you 5 reasons about Paul George's leadership not being one of his strengths.
But I can also show you that if we look at that surge in 2021, would you agree that more of the guys on that roster were PG's guys than any other year in that tenure? Because obviously Reggie was, and a lot of those other guys on that roster really talked highly about PG that season, about like what he had done that year.
I could give you quotes about them talking highly about Kawhi when he was sitting on the bench, but still involved with them and trying to help with the torn ACL. They said he was still leading then. Like, I don't know about this nebulous, tangible stuff. I know what happened out there.
Okay.
I know you like the numbers and the analytics.
Yeah,
and the
you're right. I do. If you don't want to have that conversation, then that's okay. Then if you want to have a conversation that's strictly based off of the metrics and the on-court play, then I'm totally fine with your position. We don't have any disagreement here. Kawhi is the best player. You kept the best player. You can build a championship team around the best player. And Paul George isn't worth that type of money given his inconsistency and lack of production in the playoffs. We don't have disagreement on that.
You still think he has leadership qualities, not comparative to Kawhi Leonard, just isolated to Paul George. You think there are real measurable leadership qualities from somebody who has consistently contradicted himself.
I don't think that this is as simple as, so we do this a lot in sports, right? Where leaders it's a binary. It's a 1-0, right?
Right. You were just doing it with Kawhi.
No. Here's the thing. You have to be such a 0 in these categories based off of all of the things that have been reported that I take that consideration.
But you're not taking into consideration leading by his actions. Like
I don't.
you saw with Tim Duncan.
You know, the last guy I heard, no, do not do that. Tim Duncan was a vocal leader when he needed to be. He was not a lead by example guy. Do you want to know who was? Who's a great comparison here?
David Robinson? Who you
Carmelo? No, David was a great leader. Carmelo Anthony. He was the ultimate lead by example guy. It's not a real thing in the NBA. It's not. Never has been. Leading by example, you know what that is? That you're the best player, so you get tabbed with leadership because we do this where we take players and we put all of these other attributes onto them because they're good at what they do. Well, and that's not an accurate perception.
All I know is, and a bunch of people in the comments will attest to this, when Kawhi's not there, it's like there's not an adult on the court. It's like guys aren't playing as hard because they know he's not there.
But the record doesn't really indicate that. That's not what the record has. I'll have to pull it back up. I didn't have it in front of me, but I did look this up for an article. And like the record without Kawhi is not like, they're not a 30-win team without Kawhi.
No, they're not a 30-win team without Kawhi. I'm not making that point.
Well, hang on. If
But
there's no adult. Wait. You said there's no adult on the floor. They're totally lost. I know teams that look like that. I just sat through watching about 2 hours of Portland Trailblazers film this morning. That's what that team looks like. So why is it that they don't look like a 30-win team if that's how important he is?
Because they're still slightly more talented than the Portland Trailblazers, and that's a bad example. They're not going to be just fall apart at the seams to that degree. They go from when Kawhi was on the court this past season, they went from having a defensive rating that would have been top 5 in the NBA to when he's off the court, bottom 5 in the NBA. That's how good he was. And by the way, he was saying all the things all season long. I'm trying to take this team to a place they've never been. It sure sounded like more leadership than you're giving him credit for.
That's really interesting that you think that, because I do want to because I want to ask you kind of separately. What did you think about Kawhi's defense this year? Because I thought that his strongest moments were absolutely phenomenal. And then there were a lot of times when I started to be like, oof, he is a shell of the guy I knew in 2017. Like his low points were rough.
I thought this was his best defensive year as a Clipper.
Okay.
I think it was pretty clear. And the numbers say so too. When he was on the court, the impact he had defensively.
Well,
when they beat Denver for the first time in 2 years.
I love the on-offs. You got to be a little easy on that. Like,
okay, they're not perfect. Defensive metrics, I agree with you. They're not perfect. But when I match that to the eye test, even some of the stuff in the way he was moving in the preseason, I was saying to myself, there was an old line in Friday Night Lights, I think in season 2 or something like that, where it was Smash who hurt his knee and he was trying out for a college football team. And they said, it looks like he's never hurt his knee at all. And that's how I felt at times watching Kawhi Leonard defensively this year.
Wow.
Now, defense is dependent on who's playing next to you. For sure. Who's locked in, who's playing well. It's 5 guys on a string. One guy can be great, and it really doesn't mean much. You can have good point of attack defense. If nobody's there protecting the rim, it really doesn't matter at some point.
I mean, we can also kind of look at this and say, like, and I'm not going to sit here and say PG was as good as Kawhi defensively, right? But if we're going to use that metric, they were 6.8 better with Kawhi on the floor. They were 4.2 better with Paul George.
Now, what were they on the offs?
That's a meaningful difference.
What were they on the offs?
What do you mean? Oh, it was 117.9 Kawhi, 116.3. So about 1.6 points of difference, which is meaningful, but not like, it's not this difference that you're kind of alluding to.
So it's about a +4 though net rating then overall there. The swing with Kawhi on versus off versus Paul George on versus off.
It's the difference is 4.2 to 6.8. So it's 2.6 is the on-off differential.
Okay. I'll concede that. The difference to me was,
Adam, think about it.
I can give you like specific games here.
You want to talk ball, or this is telling though. Think about how you thought of it, and then look at the reality, and that's going to tell you something. Because this is the whole thing: is like you can get caught into confirmation bias and things that reaffirm these things that we want to believe over and over and over again. Just like I can with Paul George, because I wasn't aware before Clippers fans started sending me clips that there were all these instances. And like, I've definitely taken those into consideration. Been like, man, yeah, Paul George can honestly, he can be kind of a dip sometimes. Like I knew that before from the playoff P stuff, but like this stuff is very indicative. And like, that adds more information here. So like, we don't need to like dig in and then dig in and then dig in because of defensiveness. We can try and get a more complete and accurate representation of what actually is going on.
So it's a it's a 6.8 difference, Kawhi on off, 3.1 difference, 4.2 Paul George, I should say. Over a season, it's not nothing, but I can also give you actual examples of defensive acumen with Paul George versus Kawhi Leonard. When they beat Denver for the first time in 2 years, guess what they did at the end of the game? Ivica Zubac, who we'll get into in a little bit, and Kawhi Leonard blew up their pick and roll with Jokic and Jamal Murray.
Look, I think
Paul George wasn't doing that. That was all Kawhi.
Well, let's not act like PG had a bad year defensively, though.
He had a very inconsistent year.
Oh, boy. So the only thing I would say here is
where do you think the Clippers ended up ranking defensively?
I kind of agree with you in that I thought that Kawhi's best moments, but here's what I think you're doing. You saw the best moments, and that became who you think he was the whole year.
No.
And I think that he had some games, especially like
give me those games.
I can't do them here. I'd have to that's bad podcasting, right? But I will go on Twitter and I'll try and find them and I'll try and identify them for you. Okay.
That's fair. I'm just saying overall,
Wait, if we're
he
gonna do the
probably
on,
had his best defensive year as a Clipper.
hey, I
Can
have a
you
question
always
for you.
find defensive
Wait, hang
lapses?
on.
Yes.
I have a question for you because you talked about the on-offs. Were the Clippers? Who do you think do you think the Clippers were better with Kawhi Leonard or Paul George on the floor in total net rating?
I believe it said Paul George this year.
Yeah. Do you think they were worse with Paul George on the floor or off the floor or Kawhi Leonard off the floor?
I'm going to give you that one. I'm going to give you that one.
So that's not a there, right? It's that these numbers are really contextual and we have to like dive in really deep on them
They
to be able to
are.
identify them.
I'm saying matching the eye test to the numbers.
But that
Overall, it was pretty easy to me that I would go with Kawhi Leonard as the better
But
defender
think
this
about
season.
where you're starting from. You wanted to see that Kawhi is the two-time NBA champion, best player in the league, top 5 guy, and Paul George, he's just a guy.
I think
And so
you
you saw the
wanted me
data,
to see
and
that I
so
was
you
wanting
saw the
that.
data that reaffirms that position, and we don't have to do that.
I
Like, it's
watch
okay.
possession to possession every night.
I
Like,
believe you. I
there's
believe
no
you.
Clipper fan that is going to say that Paul George was a better defender this season
But I did not
than
make that
Kawhi
argument.
Leonard overall.
I didn't make that argument.
Then what is the argument?
Because I started saying the point here is that don't use the data that confirms your belief to be like, aha, because there's going to be this other data.
I
That's like,
already admitted that it's complicated with defensive rating stuff. It's not the end all be all.
So that's
I
the thing.
completely agree on that.
And the other thing I would say is I think night to night, I will say, again, I think Kawhi's best moments defensively were among the best of his career since 2017. Like, he just hasn't been that guy. Like, yeah, I understand that's part of it for me too, is like, I watched every single defensive possession of Kawhi in 2017 when he was up for MVP. And I know how amazing he was that season and the year prior. Like, it was absolutely absurd. And so to watch him now, it's like, yeah, he's so good. He's really good most of the time, but also this is not that guy. And that's going to color my perception too, because I'm judging him against a past version of himself, which isn't fair because he's still an elite defender.
What I would say is I agree that he can still get to those levels, but it's less consistently.
Yeah, I totally agree.
But I don't think he has some extremely low floor or anything, like you were saying, starting this conversation about Kawhi's defense.
Well, I'm assuming you mean outside of the playoff series, right? When he was a shell because of the injury. Because that was nightmare.
I don't think anyone's evaluating Kawhi Leonard when he probably shouldn't have been playing on.
I'm just making sure because that was nightmarishly awful. He was clearly super hurt, but it was nightmarishly terrible.
Well, I don't know why you'd bring it up then at all if you knew he was seriously hurt.
I'm clarifying that we're going to remove that. That's okay.
I didn't insert it to start with, so I'm not going to evaluate anyone when they look that banged up to the point they're swinging on the rim because they're afraid of the fall that will impact their knee afterwards.
So bad, but I mean,
it was painful to watch, and I'm sure play with.
From all this conversation, I do want to ask you, how do you feel about your leader, the number one guy, clearly the franchise icon, the face of the really, in my opinion, I don't think Harden is even at that level anymore. So the face of the franchise being Kawhi Leonard at this point, how do you feel about that?
I think when you said, let me make sure I get this right. I think when you said that the issue with the Clippers failing, here's the quote: I routinely see the Clippers fail because of the leadership that comes with Kawhi as the best player, is completely inaccurate.
Okay.
The Clippers have not failed because of Kawhi's leadership. They have failed because Kawhi's health has failed him. And that is by far the biggest reason that the 2-1-3 era did not end with a ring.
Okay.
I think looking for the intangibles when there's something much more obvious, like guy tears his ACL, then his meniscus, then last season has the swelling in his right knee. I think that is the main issue going on with this team, unfortunate health.
Sure. That's sure. I don't disagree that that's like the main thing, right? The problem I think here is...
But you're saying they're failing because of his leadership. That's what you said.
Well, listen, can you hear me out? Okay.
I just read it. Okay.
The idea here is that that's not a failure. When you're hurt, when your best player is out, the 2021 Western Conference Finals are not a failure because Kawhi was out. Now, what I do think is notable is I felt like that 2021 year was the closest that we got to an actual synergy and an even partnership between Kawhi and PG. Did it feel like that to you, or do you disagree with that assessment?
The 2021 season?
Yeah.
I think Nicholas Batum did a lot for that locker room. I think Serge Ibaka, even being out at times, did a lot for that locker room. The familiarity with him and Kawhi Leonard. The vibes were right. Reggie Jackson was huge for them that season. He played like a damn all-star when Kawhi went down in the playoffs.
That's PG's guy, by the way.
And Ty Lue. It's Ty Lue. Ty Lue was the biggest difference.
For sure. I don't even disagree with that. So I thought that they were going to, I really did think when they were up against the Jazz, I was like, they're going to win the title because I love their matchup versus the Suns. And I really like their matchup versus the Bucks as well. It would have been really close, but I really think they would have, gotten there. Sorry, 2021.
Some of my damn passwords are Clippers win 2021. Like, I fully believe if Kawhi doesn't go down, get hurt, then we're talking about this being a successful tenure. Paul George is probably still here. He's more of a legacy player because he won them in their first championship. He was on that team.
Totally
changes everything.
Yeah, it changes everything. That team was awesome and amazing. And to me, that team was finding the balance between letting Kawhi be Kawhi and having a more connected identity. A lot of this for me also is like, I've seen these combinations of players, these super teams fail so consistently because of that intangible stuff. It's not about the talent. It's about all the other stuff. And so when I look at the Clippers and I look at some of the reasons why they haven't been able to get where they wanted to go when they've been healthy, why they haven't been better when they've been healthy, a lot of it for me has come back to those kind of identities. And yeah, like that 2020, if we're going to use these individual moments, I feel like you're under indexing that 2020 bubble failure, because that is a horrific, nightmarish failure of epic collapse.
I said it was a complete collapse and meltdown.
Yeah. And so we have to kind of consider that in the context. And I don't disagree with you if you're like, look, it was Doc Rivers. And if you say that, I'm going to be like, yeah, that's fair.
I'm not putting it all on Doc. However, when you're putting Montrezl Harrell, who just returned to basketball, on the court next to Nikola Jokic, and people are saying, well, Jokic is going to score on anyone. What does it matter? It's like, well, he's shooting 75% against Montrezl Harrell and 50% against Ivica Zubac. There's a big difference there.
Totally agree. So the Ty Lue thing is actually really interesting too, because Lue was so good in 2021, and in the following 2022, 2023, and 2024 seasons.
Tell me about 2022, because you said something interesting in the comments saying, well, I am going back on what Paul George did in 2021 and 2022 on those runs. And I'm thinking there was no 2022.
Yeah, there was no run. I'm thinking more of the 2023.
He wasn't available in 2023 against Phoenix. Kawhi went down after the first two games.
Yep.
Look, it's tough to keep. There's been a lot of injuries. It is tough to keep track of everything going on with the Clippers. Trust me, I have trouble, and I followed this team the entire time.
Right. So
it's brutal.
Yeah, and I hear that dynamic in terms of like I could have gotten all the numbers right on this. What I will say though, I think that there's probably something to be said for the fact. How often is it that the team is built around Kawhi being number one? You'd agree with that, right? That's how the team is built.
Kawhi is their hammer.
Even if Ty Lue was like, we got you're this guy, the Kawhi has to be Kawhi.
And yeah, he does. And as you have said, you believe they would have won in 2021 with Kawhi being Kawhi as the number one for the team.
Totally agree. And
what's the issue?
I'm not I want to be clear on this because of the things I said earlier about the Kawhi's history. I'm not disputing that Kawhi Leonard can be the best player on a championship team. I'm not disputing that at all.
Well, obviously, that's indisputable. You wouldn't say that.
Right. Yeah. I wouldn't say that.
But even in this Clippers era, in a hypothetical of him not getting hurt in 2021, you admit they would have won the championship.
Yes.
So was there something wrong with his leadership? Is there something wrong with the way the team was built?
Because in my opinion, from where I was at that time, Paul George was doing a lot of that work that season.
He was much better, and that was easily his best playoff run as a Clipper.
There you go. And that's like the synergy combination, that special chemistry that you need. You need someone to do those things for Kawhi, so Kawhi can go out and shoot mid-range jumpers at an extremely lethal rate.
I'm still not sure what those things are and how they translate, and if there's anything to actually grasp tangibly there.
Okay, so
as I mentioned, he's flip-flopped on roles. He's contradicted himself with, they get James Harden this year. Well, now we can do the dirty work, me and Kawhi. Now we can do all this. After the season, we lost Batum, we lost Rocco. We had to do too much of the little thing. I can't tell you how many times he has managed it. I love Paul George.
No, you don't. It's okay. You can admit that.
No.
Admit that.
I think he's a top 5 Clipper of all time. He's always been one of my favorite players because I side with two-way players. I like those guys.
Yeah.
The dunk on Birdman is legendary and had me out of my seat, and I knew where I was when that happened. I love Paul George, and again, they're going to miss what he does on the court.
And I won't dispute.
What I'm saying is when you're talking about a leader, like that involves responsibility, accountability. That involves not complaining about. He had a clip recently on Podcast P saying, I I got to play defense and play multiple possessions there and then bring the ball up the court. And I'm tired. And he goes, but that's not an excuse, but it's just what it is. It's like nobody wants to hear that stuff.
That's actually more common than you think, but I will totally.
But no, not from players saying it. Like, we know it's tiring. We know it is, but it sounds like you're building an excuse. We've heard it too many times.
But why is it only with him? Like, why is it?
Because Kawhi, I don't know. Kawhi doesn't have a podcast. Kawhi doesn't talk like that in post-game pressers. He's not the one saying he's the number 2. He's not the one saying they don't have an identity after they just went 26-5 over a 31-game stretch. He's not the one having to be talked to by Coach Lue. Like, Paul George is an all-time Hall of Famer, but he's just those aren't his strengths.
The other thing now, see, this is the thing was you're right that we've turned it into like Kawhi versus PG. I think one of the things, and when he was in Oklahoma City, I did a big sit-down interview with him for his MVP campaign that season. And one of the things I kind of noticed was like, wow, like you'll go out and you'll have like these bursts in these games where you'll score like 12 in a 5-minute span. And then the next quarter, you will just have like 4 assists and kind of blend. And like he talked a lot about that, about how his game is a lot more driven that way. And I think that that's part of like what can be frustrating with him as a number 1B or 2 or whatever, is that he is a player, and this is on him. This is on him, that he is a player that wants to meld around the game flow. And if you are that level of player, you have to be a guy who is making that impact on every single possession. And Kawhi does that. Go ahead.
I completely agree with your point there. And coming off of that campaign, your top 3 MVP, your top 3 defensive player of the year, he made 3rd team one time as a Clipper. Yeah. I know some of that is due to injuries, but the two-way superstar, there are so many peaks and valleys. The roller coaster you go through to get to his final numbers at the end of the season is like nothing I've ever seen, because I honestly think he's probably one of the top 10 most talented players in NBA history, talent-wise. A guy with his handle and shooting ability at that height is so rare. The talent is so tantalizing that it makes you longing for more from him.
Yeah.
And, a victim maybe of his own success to some degree, but he was billed as a number 1. Then he says, I'm not number 1, I'm a number 2.
When did he say that? When was that quote from?
You want me to play
it? I just need the date. I just need the year.
I'll tweet it at you. I have it on my Twitter. I think it was the beginning of last year, so late 2022.
Okay, so that to me is really relevant here. If he had said that after 2020, I would be a little bit more in line with you, because what I think really, I do think some of this is, let's try and give both players genuinely the most benefit of the doubt here. I think that he was trying to figure out how to make it work, just like Kawhi was trying to figure out how to make it work.
I mean, they won it close to a 700 win percentage when they were both on the floor. It worked on the floor. There weren't many issues there. The issue was just having the availability when they could actually play.
In my experience, players don't look at it that way, though.
Well, they know when they're winning games. They know when they're going on winning streaks. They know when things are good, when things are clicking. Now, Paul George did say after this season, a lot of people thought he was alluding to the fact that he didn't like playing off ball as much next to James Harden, because he kept saying, here's another great quote, it's not about winning a championship so much in my career. And then he said that was taken out of context too. But he kept pointing to, it's about playing basketball the right way. And a lot of people inferred from that, is he talking about James Harden? Like, what is going on here? The ball was in his hands less. Meanwhile, he was Michael Porter Jr. on steroids when they won 26 out of 31 games, and Paul George was putting up some of the highest efficiency numbers of his career. It was working very well. So maybe you're right. Even though it was working that well, he didn't like his role, or he didn't see it that way. But that's the problem. He doesn't like his role as the number 1. He doesn't want his role as number 2. Is he at number 3? Is he number 3 now on a championship team? I don't know. I just know at his highest level, he could be a top 10 player in the league. But from night to night, you get top 10 or you get top 35 player.
That's fair. You've listed all these quotes. Did you get the sense that he was always unhappy the last 2 years?
No. I think he's kind of low key. He's not a very emotional player.
Agreed.
Sometimes, big dunk on Birdman, exceptions like that, big plays. But he is even keel. And this was the first time when he had that quote this year in the second half of the season, after they had that amazing run. They blew out Boston in Boston. Everybody was saying, oh, the Clippers are ready. This is it. They figured it out. They went through a bit of a swoon for about a month and a half, and they were about a 500 team. That's when that quote came out about him talking about, we don't have an identity. he didn't offer any solutions, and Coach Lou then had to talk to him and actually said in his presser, like, did we have an identity when we went 26-5 in a 31 game stretch? So like that stuff to me, I don't know if that's helpful from your leaders, just throwing out a grenade.
Mhm.
Oh, we don't have an identity, like, but not
Yeah.
offering anything or just
So
giving the media that red meat.
yeah, I think that's fair, right? And these are things that were brought up to me where I was like, ooh, that's not a good look, right? Uh, can we admit that so much of this is pointed through the prism of the contract dispute? That like you're probably not on here basically building a case against Paul George if there's not the dispute over the money, which caused so much of the tension. And I would carry through from that and point out, I think a lot of the stuff with PG this year was built off of that, because once you start messing with the money, guys' brains go haywire. And that's really consistent.
I think that would be easier to dismiss as, oh, it's contract negotiations weighing on him if he didn't have so many 3-week stretches as a Clipper where he's scoring under 20 points a game or his efficiency's way down. He's such a rhythm guy.
Mm-hmm.
He's just, the highs are very high and the lows are very low from him because he won't force it. He won't put up 10 threes.
And you feel,
but he probably should with the way he shoots from the outside.
Yeah. And you feel like it's
I
better.
think it's in line with how he's been throughout most of his career. I don't think I can just put it on the contract. I'm not saying that didn't weigh on him at all. Obviously, it would anyone. But I can't just say, well, this is a unique situation this year with Paul George. This has been happening for some time.
We also kind of do, and like, look, we can point some of the advanced metrics. Like he had his highest EPM since 2019 when he left the Thunder.
Oh, he had a really good year because that 30-game stretch, he shot it like 50, 50, 90. It was insane.
But also, you agree with me, like he started off the season in such a great place.
He had a great I thought he had a very good first month.
And I think that he got caught very much in a middle spot where he is a player, like I said, and this is not, you can just say like he needed to just be aggressive and just be him, fit out, not fit in, right? Via LeBron. I think he got really caught when it was Kawhi and then PG. I think he just kind of figured out how to play around Kawhi to a good enough level. And then you add in Harden, and now there's another dynamic to figure out. And I don't want to use that as an excuse. It's more of an explanation for why he would talk about the game the way that he did versus this idea that you're kind of presenting here, which is that he whined, complained, and was a locker room problem all year, which I didn't feel was accurate, but maybe I'm wrong.
That's a bit of a mischaracterization. That's a little bit too strong.
No, I'm telling you.
I'm saying lack of leadership stuff.
I'm telling you.
I didn't say whine.
Right, but I'm telling you that's how it, like, that's what you are giving me, that I'm like, oh, like all of these examples. He said this and 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 this. Like that's giving me the perception that not only was he not a leader,
but that's not just this year. I'm going back his entire Clippers tenure.
Okay.
That is his entire tenure.
Okay.
He says one thing, he says another. He's talking out of both sides of his mouth while his foot is in it at the same time. That's what it feels like. It is perplexing.
And so
I think he's a really nice guy. And sometimes that can work against you because you're not always as accurate with your words all the time and things can be misperceived, you know?
Yeah. I totally agree. My question for you, though, I think here is, okay, to whatever degree Paul George was not good enough at the role that we're ascribing to him from a basketball and leadership standpoint, do you concur with me that somebody's got to do that when Kawhi Leonard's your best guy? Do you agree with me on that end?
That they need more leadership, more of an ass kicker? Yeah, I agree with that. I think they missed that when Patrick Beverley left.
So that's my big concern.
He was also huge in 2021, by the way, when we talk about that year.
This might be a good way to kind of frame it is, I'm not saying Paul George is an amazing leader. I'm saying Paul George was the one doing that stuff because your number one guy is never going to do any of it.
I just don't see any examples of him doing that stuff. I see the opposite. Okay. I've given multiple examples of the opposite.
Well, okay, no. Let's be clear. Let's be precise here, right?
Yeah.
You've given examples of a lack of accountability, which is an element of leadership, but is not the entirety of what is a very large nebulous role, right?
Dependability, consistency, having a consistent message. I don't see it throughout his Clippers tenure. I'm not saying he's, some terrible guy or bad.
You're saying he's not you're saying he's not a cancer. He's just not a leader. He's just
exactly. He's not a malcontent. He's not a locker room cancer. Guys like him and all that. But there's a difference between that and being the alpha or saying, get behind me. or, you know, getting everybody in
So
line and being at the front
I
of the
don't
boat.
define leadership that way because that's a little bit of an outdated model. And one, like we've got a lot of examples of that actually not being great in a number of circumstances. It can work, but it doesn't necessarily work all the time. And there's a lot of different ways of leadership in the NBA that
That's
guys have
fine.
talked about.
But the stuff he was doing kind of flies in the face of leadership as a
If we
whole.
take these specific comments as his track record entirely, I don't disagree. So
That's all. That's all I'm saying.
believe
I
that I
just don't
couldn't
see him as the
do you
leader
believe I
guy,
could
and
do
Kawhi
you
is the action guy.
do you
That's
believe do you believe I couldn't find any examples throughout the history of all of his comments or comments from players of any sort of indication to the contrary?
of course you're going to find players that say he's a great leader. Everybody can find
Well,
teammates that say
so,
this.
well,
They
hang on.
brought in plenty of his favorites to the Clippers to be with him, to make him as comfortable as possible.
My only point here is you're using here, I have pulled these 10 things and this proves why, along with the numbers. And I'm like, well, okay, those are indications that we need to consider. That's evidence, right? But I'm not necessarily sure that we can just sit here and be like, so case closed. Is that fair?
I don't know if any case is ever closed. I just think there's far more indicators that that's not one of his strengths, as opposed to he's the leader guy, Kawhi has to do the other stuff, and Paul George does this stuff. I don't see it like that at all.
That's fair. That's totally fair. This is a good discussion.
I thought so.
And
I can't believe you came on for this long.
and we'll see what happens when Kawhi Leonard is the only guy that you've got to be able to set a tone and do all that stuff. We'll see how that goes.
See, now you're framing it though. You did this in the text too. There's only two options.
Yep.
Oh, good luck without Paul George. As if they brought him back, it guarantees a championship, like we haven't seen the last 5 years.
No, and that's fair. Like that's the thing.
There's a wide spectrum of possibilities, right?
But man, I will just tell you, when I looked at this team and was like, okay, so who's going to be like the top of this team? It's Kawhi Leonard and James Harden. Oh God.
Two guys that have never missed the playoffs in their career.
They're great players. They're phenomenal, man. I have written more on James Harden than I have on any other player.
I guess I'm more interested in production, efficiency, and effectiveness than the intangibles like leadership.
Yeah, I'll be honest with you. So, like, I pay a lot of attention to that stuff, right? Like,
I know you do.
I dig through the numbers, I dig through the film, and
that's why we hardly ever disagree on anything.
Right.
I've been following you forever. I have a great respect for you.
I try and get the film and the numbers to match up in a way that I can understand. But the third component of that is when I started being and I'm not in locker room. I don't like to say that when people's like, well, I'm in locker rooms. No, you're not. You're in the media allowed portion of the locker room availability. It's not the same thing. But when you're around teams more, you do get these real senses of how important that stuff is, at least to them. And like, that's a fascinating question in of itself. Is this stuff as important as they think it is? But I have to respect the athlete in order to consider, and the coaches I've talked to, in how important this stuff is.
Okay, here's a transition, and I'll let you go in the next 5-10 minutes if that's all right.
I'm good, man. You got time.
Thank you. Russell Westbrook, renowned for his leadership. Every guy wants to play with him. Every guy loves Russell Westbrook. Paul George campaigned to have him in the locker room after Lawrence Frank clearly came out and said the type of point guard they were looking for, which Russ didn't match any of those traits. And then PG said, go out and get Russ. And they did it for him, just like they did for multiple guys, John Wall, Reggie Jackson, which did work out. But Russell Westbrook, of course, he's a winner. Of course, he's an all-time great. I think there is some dispute over whether or not you can win it at the highest level with his style of basketball, despite him being well-liked, being loved by everyone in the locker room. And now he's in Denver, and I have to get your thoughts on what they're going to do. I keep joking that Jokic is looking for a new challenge or something. Russell Westbrook is amazing. But at this point of his career, he just went 8 of 42 in the last 5 games of that series against the Dallas Mavericks.
So painful.
It was the worst 5-game stretch shooting-wise in playoff history. And they needed him badly. Obviously, Kawhi was banged up. Paul George was only getting 19 per game and, more importantly, only taking less than 16 shots, which was really frustrating because you kind of at least got to go out shooting, go out firing there. But how do you think it's going to translate next to Nikola Jokic? It feels like a strange fit for a team that is so in sync with one another and everyone knowing their roles. And now you have another guy who has to have the ball in his hands to really be effective.
I think that was true a year ago, and this is proof of how ephemeral chemistry can be. It's
That's
just
fair
very
too.
difficult to. It's so hard, man. Like you can have great chemistry one year, and fans think, oh, they have such great chemistry, and then they bring back the same people, and the fans are like, we'll be the exact same because they brought back all the same players. And I'm always like, it's never the same. Everything changes with how players grow as people, and especially with the money. That's always a thing that gets in the way of these teams. With regard to Russ, it's either going to be the greatest accomplishment of Russ, Jokic, and Malone's careers for figuring out how to make it work, or this is going to be a train wreck rolling downhill on fire. They need Westbrook because they've never had a guy who will challenge them this way. Jamal Murray needs a guy to be like, I'm coming at your throat in every single practice. If you're not good enough, I'll take your starting spot by sheer force of will. Malone has always struggled, not always. Malone has the potential to really struggle because he's a stubborn guy and a fierce competitor, just the way that Westbrook is. And those two could butt heads. They could find a kindred spirit in one another, and that they're so obsessive about winning and doing it their way and be on the same path. Jokic gets the best out of everybody, and he's the biggest reason why Westbrook is in Denver this season. He wanted Westbrook specifically. He believes in this guy, I think in part because Russ takes no prisoners, always plays hard, doesn't save himself. He respects that, admires it, and will try and find ways to get the best out of him. But at the core of this is that Russ has never, not once, we talked about how much PG tries to mold to the game and he does it too much. Russ is the reason those two work together was because of that dynamic, because Russ has never melded to anyone. His whole thing of it being why not is proof of concept of him always believing, why should I change? Look at the success that I've had doing it my way. And so I'll just do it my way. And I thought last season was the most he's ever tried, especially putting more effort in on the defensive end and trying at least to not be as ball dominant when he shared the floor with some of the other guys, that he made small efforts in those areas, but he's still always going to be Russ. He's going to find a loose ball and he's going to throw up a pull-up three-pointer at the worst possible moment. He's going to get downhill in transition and take a pull-up jumper for no apparent reason when it's the last shot that he needs to take. The guy
Kawhi will go into the fetal position having seen that shot like he did in Utah.
Yes, and so it is going to either be a great success or it is going to be absolutely terrible to the point where they may have to release him just to save the situation and do it before Christmas. And I don't know which one it's going to be.
Do you think, though, because to me, he still can be a regular season floor raiser. It's the playoffs where his style of play is exposed more than ever. Turns out being erratic when you have to be more methodical isn't a good mix for playoff basketball. Couldn't things go well in the regular season? He could be an innings eater for them. And then they get to the playoffs and realize, oh, we can't play this guy 20 to 25 minutes anymore.
Yeah, I don't think the plan is to play him 20, 25 minutes in the playoffs. I think the plan is really genuinely to give them a guy who can play 10 to 15 minutes a night in the playoffs. And I think there's probably a strong possibility that they're going to lose those minutes and that he may not be playable. One of the things that's really important is that when you get to Russ's level, and I mean this in a bad way, when he's no longer an elite guy and he's down in here in this role player territory, there are series. Like there's just series where a guy is good and a guy is bad. Like I thought Ivica Zubac was so freaking good versus the Mavericks. And I just was baffled at how they went away from him after that game one.
It's like they wanted Cody Zeller in there instead of Big Zoo.
It was just crazy.
I'm kidding. So, I'm going back to an old comment. You used to say Cody Zeller was better than Ivica Zubac, but that's a different argument for another day.
Cody was better at that time. So but with this, I'll just say that I think that Russ is going to have series where he's absolutely unplayable. And it may be as simple as he can play in the first round and he can't play after that. Maybe it's he can play in the first two rounds, but he can't play after that. But there is no expectation of him being a viable 15-plus minute player if they were to reach the NBA Finals. But if they reach the NBA Finals, then guess what? He's helped them get there. And that's probably a positive here. But yeah, if they become dependent on him, like my real fear is that I don't necessarily think that Christian Brown's ready for this elevation to the starting unit. And if Christian Brown goes through a prolonged shooting struggle, where the offense is just not executing the way it needs to be, and Russ is playing awesome off the bench, there's going to be a conversation about should Russ start. And once you go down that road, the Nuggets ceiling is capped. So that to me is like a bigger concern. I agree with you that Russell Westbrook cannot be a significant key component in a playoff run at this point in his career.
So you're going in with this with your eyes open. I'm guessing all of Denver Nuggets Nation are following you in that and understand what they're getting exactly with Russell Westbrook. Are the Russ stands? Are they already out and about?
Oh, they're already there. They're already
We
out.
pushed them your way.
Well, it's just funny because I've seen them go from like I've been in these conversations from Oklahoma City to Houston to Washington to the Lakers to the Clippers and now here. And so it's just like I've like every beat writer or blogger or podcaster that I know has commented to me like, God, I just hate the Russ stands. And so what'll really be tough is if he struggles, the Russ stands meeting the Serbian Jokic fans, and those two colliding is going to be ugly in a lot of ways.
Does Russ have brothers like Jokic that'll be at every game? I hope you don't see anything like that. I'd be worried for Jamal Murray. He has a bad game. Russell Westbrook has a good game. And everybody goes, oh, you see, Russell Westbrook should be the number 2 now. That's crazy talk. But I got to ask you about Kobe Brown with the Clippers because you're a Mizzou guy.
Yep.
What's his ceiling? What's his floor? Who can he be for the Clippers? People have said, oh, he's Draymond Green. I've mentioned like maybe he's got, I don't know, Ryan Anderson or Boris Diaw type of game. And that's still probably lofty expectations. But what did you see from him in college that can translate to the NBA?
You know, I think the biggest thing probably is that I think he's got more to show than what he's been able to kind of illustrate so far. And I think that he's got a real opportunity. I think especially if he can focus on rebounding, like that to me is like a key area here where like he's just got to become a better rebounder if he's going to be like an all around player, because he is going to have to kind of fill in those gaps. You mentioned those kind of guys. And so like without a consistent jumper, I don't know what his ceiling is going to be. Like, I just don't think that he's ever going to be able to be a key component on a team if he's not able to find that kind of performance. But it starts, I think, with rebounding. He's going to have to become a quality rebounder at 6'7". And that to me is going to have to be like the starting point for him.
No, that's a great point because they have a need at the 4. If they want Kawhi slotted back in the 3, somebody's got to take that 4 spot. So he could have an opportunity this year to really show something. Quickly, marketing gets $240 million. Does this mean anything for guys like Zach LaVine or who am I thinking of up in Portland right now?
Anthony Simons?
Not Anthony Simon. Jeremy Grant, Brandon Ingram. Any of those guys, do teams start to get desperate knowing that Lauri Markkanen is no longer available? He can't be traded for another 6 months, which is after the trade deadline. So next offseason.
I don't think so, because I think it kind of comes down to LaVine, Ayton, Grant are all going to be players that are moved if a team is like, if they face injuries or a start to the season where they're like, we got to do something. Those are we got to do something guys. Versus Markkanen was like a real upside, like, hey, we could really invigorate the franchise. Like the Warriors and Kings were pursuing those looks based off of the idea of like, we could take this thing to an entirely other level. There are guys that you trade for out of opportunity, and there are guys that you trade for out of desperation. And I think Jeremy Grant, Ayton, LaVine, Brandon Ingram, I think is a really interesting one. And the situation that they're facing there is like, do you look at Ingram as a desperation guy, or do you look at Ingram as like an opportunity guy? Because I think he's firmly in kind of the middle of that kind of that line between those two things. But
he's only 27. He's got upside still.
Yeah, upside still. So I think there's probably like, I don't think there's going to be a lot of moves between now and the first month of the season. There's kind of like these benchmarks that at least the executives have told me about, that the first 30 days is when you're looking to see like, oh no, we are not nearly what we thought we were going to be. And that's when teams start to shop aggressively. December, when they realize they got to do it now or it's too late. And then the deadline is more looking forward to the next year. It's one reason why I think we've seen slower deadlines, is teams are mostly doing all that stuff in the off season now. So I don't necessarily think the marketing changes a whole lot, especially because I was just confused why anyone was pursuing these talks at all. Like, I'm really confused why the Warriors had this many conversations about it, because everyone I talked to was like, yeah, no, Ainge is just getting the value for him before he gives him the extension. Because that's what you do, is like, you see what their value is before the extension, and then you give them the extension. So later you can go back and say, well, look, before we paid him, you thought he was this, and now he's a better player. So even with the money, he's got to be worth this. You're setting a bar for those types of things. I never thought Danny Ainge was going to trade Markkanen. So I don't necessarily know why Markkanen going off the market would change much, other than for the Warriors to maybe make it known we know we don't have enough right now that we need in order to make a run.
Yeah, Markkanen is young enough to where he could still be in the Jazz's timeline if they figure things out fast enough here, or they have a great asset to trade down the line. I got one thing to give out quickly. The second keyword, if you're watching this video and want that Intuit Dome Clippers hat, I'm going there this weekend, is home. You put the first keyword, the second keyword in the comment section below. First one was given out last show. And if you are first, you will win a Clippers hat, and you can get at me for whatever one you want at the flagship store. Lastly, before we get out of here, Matt, I appreciate your time, and you have been an absolute star. I do want to ask you, one of my favorite segments is favorites. First, one of your favorite things going on right now, whether it's a movie, a TV show, something you ate, a video game, anything it could be that you want to recommend to the audience. And then second, your least favorite thing. So I'll go first, so you get a little more time to think about it. I'm going to say Cobra Kai, the start of season 6, I think it is, the final season. The first 5 episodes, not bad. Was I upset that they weren't releasing all of it at once? Yes. But we got 5 episodes in, and it started a little bit slow. It got better as it went along. I'm a sucker for the pettiness and the juvenile talk in that show and the ass kicking. I love it. And I'm kind of glad they're actually dragging it out now, because I'll get a little bit more time. I think it's not going to finish till next year. So that's my favorite right now, Cobra Kai.
My favorite will be the dining in Duck, North Carolina. I went to the Outer Banks for a nice getaway for a week. And I stayed in Southern Shores, which is about 5 miles south of Duck. And every restaurant in Duck was banging. Every single one. Crab Shacks, great places up and down. The food was absolutely phenomenal. The seafood was out of this world. In Southern Shores, right down the road, there's a killer ice cream shop next to a pizza joint called Southern Shores Pizza, which was phenomenal. I got away for a little bit, had an Airbnb on the sound side. It was absolutely terrific. So that would be my favorite for this episode.
Sounds lovely. Least favorite, other end of the spectrum. Game of Thrones, House of the Dragon. The last episode of this season, extremely disappointing. After the setup in episode 7 or whatever it was the week before, where you see all the dragons puffing their chest out, they got the dragon super team, you think it's on, and then they just built everything up to where you're going to see the battle next year, I guess, in the next season. That was not it for me. Plus, I don't need to see any more White Walker stuff. I don't need to hear winter's coming. They already ruined the ultimate ending. I kind of like just living in the Game of Thrones world like we were with House of the Dragons, and not thinking about how poorly the show ended initially. But now they're kind of connecting them too much right now. It is bugging me. So least favorite there. What about you, Matt?
I'm not a Throneser, so I'm always amused by watching people go through the roller coaster that life is being a Throneser. Mine is a little bit more serious, and it's going to be climate change. I live in northern Colorado, and last 2 weeks we've had forest fires pop up here. We're having the worst forest fires pretty much every season that we've had ever. It's every single year. It's forest fires in a major way. The last one was the evacuation zone was 2 miles from my house, and I had to pack up absolutely everything. Extremely grateful for all the firefighters that helped combat that thing. It's an incredible job, and their resources and level of work and coordination that go into those things is absolutely phenomenal. But it's going to continue to be a huge problem, and I don't think people understand how bad this stuff is going to get. So climate change leading to forest fires is my least favorite thing.
As if this episode wasn't thought-provoking enough. Matt Moore at HP Basketball is where you find him. I was lucky for you to be able to do this with me today, to take the opportunity to take some time out of your day to do this. You didn't have to do this. We got into the argument a month ago. I'm trying to get this YouTube off the ground. I can't thank you enough, Matt.
Thanks for having me. I will say you got the better of me. I'm like a fighter that's like goes to the back, like knows after the fight. It's like, I'm probably going to lose this on decision.
No,
I got worked a little bit there.
I feel the same way. Nobody won. We all, it was the friends we met along the way. It was that type of show.
Thanks for having me, man. I appreciate it.
This has been another episode of Clippers Talk. I'm Adam Auslund. Until next time, probably coming up later this week, trying to get Carlo or Brian Seaman on. Joseph Ryan Wars coming on next week. Either way, we'll talk to you then. Again, everybody get in the comment section and thank Matt Moore for coming into the Lions Den. And I was like Simba. I wasn't even full grown yet. Love you guys. We'll talk to you next show.